Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our monthly meeting of Amateur Astronomers Incorporated. Our guest speaker tonight is Jonathan Ward. Jonathan H. Ward is the author of 4 critically acclaimed books on American space history. Most recently, he collaborated with astronaut Eileen Collins on her autobiography, Through the Glass Ceiling to the Stars, the story of the first American woman to command a space mission. His previous book, Bringing Columbia Home, is considered the definitive story of the aftermath of the 2003 Columbia accident. Jonathan is a fellow of the Royal Astronomical Society and a NASA Solar System ambassador, and is a resident astronomer for Viking Ocean Cruises. He's also an avid astrophotographer. Jonathan joins us for this meeting from his home in Greensboro, North Carolina. And this evening, we'll hear about the inspiring story of Eileen Collins, who rose from an impoverished childhood to become NASA's first female pilot and commander. And just before we begin, those of you online, I'll ask you please to remember to mute yourselves. Okay. Jonathan,
yes, sir.
Take it away.
Thank you so much for that warm introduction, and thank you everybody for coming today. I look forward to sharing with you an amazing story about somebody who's become a very good friend of mine, but one of the most inspiring people I've ever met in my life. We'll go through the course of the presentation here, and be glad to take questions at the end. I think it'd be the best thing to do. As we mentioned, I've got 4 books about the space program. 2 of them are about the Apollo program, Bringing Columbia Home about the Space Shuttle Columbia accident, and then Through the Glass Ceiling to the Stars with Eileen. Eileen Collins is a very fascinating person to me. She came from a relatively ordinary background in Elmira, New York. She lived in Elmira, was born there in 1956. She's just a couple of months younger than me. And so it was really interesting in the process of working with her to kind of compare where we were at various points in our lives at the same time, and to see how our careers diverged. Obviously, she went on to do really wonderful things. This is a picture that's outside of Elmira. This is the billboard of some of their famous citizens, including Hal Roach and Mark Twain. Eileen there. Tommy Hilfiger was one of the people from her hometown, but they certainly consider her to be one of their favorite citizens. Eileen was one of 4 children. She was the second of 4. This is her in the center here of this photograph. Her father was a surveyor with the city of Elmira, and she learned to enjoy looking at maps and learning about surveying instruments and learning about math and things like that from him. But the problem that he had was that he was a horrible alcoholic, and reached a point where he was injuring himself frequently, ending up in the hospital. And her mother, finally, when Eileen was 9 years old, kicked Eileen's father out of the house, and they never divorced, but he was not allowed to live with the family for the rest of that time. And being at that point now a single mother, Eileen's mother had to go to work for the local prison as a stenographer. The family went on welfare and was using food stamps and living in subsidized housing with the 4 kids and their mother. The father kept in touch with them. He would come to Elmira during the weekends on occasion and take the kids out. You'll see here there's a glider, a sailplane on the field behind them. Elmira was known as the soaring capital of the world. Harris Hill there is an ideal spot for sailplanes. And Eileen's father would take the kids out to watch the sailplanes fly over. Eileen, just fascinated with watching these planes flying, and never actually thought she would fly one herself at this age. This is her when she's about 10 or 11 years old. She was an avid reader, but had to get all of her books from the library because they couldn't afford to buy books for her own. So when people ask her if she has any books left from her childhood, she said she really never actually owned any because she got them all from the public library. But she did have this love for flying that was instilled from a very early age. those of you, a lot of you probably remember Hurricane Agnes in June of 1972. And this was a storm that went up the east coast of the US and stalled out over over the Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey area and brought tremendous flooding to the area. This is Eileen's house. As you'll see here, the floodwater is rising. The floodwaters eventually went up above the level of the porch and into the first floor of her house. And there's a picture of Eileen and her brothers taking a look at the floodwaters coming up. This was obviously it was a tragedy for lots of people. It was a real breaking point for her mother. The stress of both trying to raise the kids by herself and now having to deal with a house that was pretty well trashed by this flood took a tremendous psychological toll on her mother. And in the January of 1974, when Eileen was a senior in high school, Eileen had just gotten her driver's license, and the next day her mother attempted suicide, overdosing on pills. And Eileen, she had some sort of nervous breakdown, and Eileen had to drive her to the hospital. Her first trip with her new license was to take her mother to the hospital to be looked after. And Eileen ended up staying at home. Her brother had gone off to school. Her older brother had gone off to school. So Eileen was the oldest of the three kids that were still there. And Eileen took care of her younger brother and her sister by herself in that house for several months until her mother was released from the hospital. Something obviously that wouldn't allow to happen nowadays. The kids would have been fostered out somewhere. But if you can imagine trying to basically run your household when you're a senior in high school, it's just difficult for me to imagine that kind of stress for her. And when she did graduate finally from high school, she said she was never a very great student. She got by with B's and C's, never really applied herself. She never really thought about what it was she wanted to do after she got out of high school. And it was only at her high school graduation when she saw people walking across stage and getting diplomas and getting recognized for various achievements that she suddenly said she felt like she had wasted her entire school career. She thought she might become a math teacher. She really liked math, but she never took advanced placement classes in math or anything like that. In fact, she didn't even take any math classes her senior year of high school. And so she resolved then and there that she was going to try to do something with her life. Too many of her friends she knew had a future that was going to be involved getting married and just staying there in Elmira and never really actually doing anything with their lives. And she wanted to do something better for herself. So she went to Corning Community College for 2 years. She found out about community college, put herself through there. She was able to stay at home with her mother and her younger siblings, work odd jobs and still commute to college. And then when it came time to finish up her 2 years in community college, she applied to Syracuse University. At this time, this was the first time that the Air Force and the various services were starting to admit women as professional officers. In the past, women could only be enlisted people in the services. And so this was right at this time here in 1975, 76 timeframe. The services were just starting to allow women to apply. And so Syracuse had an ROTC program that was allied with the Air Force. And suddenly Eileen saw this as potentially a possibility for her to be able to get into the Air Force through ROTC. And of course, it really helped that they paid for her higher education, so her family didn't have to take on that financial burden. So here's Eileen on the right here in ROTC in college. She had she had a ROTC leader. I'm getting some sort of really weird thing going on with my screen here. Sorry about that. She had a very, let's see, I'm going to have to restart this. It looks like are you seeing a settings screen on your?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I'm trying to get rid of it. I can't seem to close it. I'm going to stop sharing and start again. Sorry about that. Something impacted my screen here. Okay. Well, I'll start it from this slide here. Sorry about that, folks. Okay, here we go. All right. So anyway, Eileen had a commanding officer in her ROTC program who recognized her potential and encouraged her to apply to be one of 10 Air Force. The Air Force was going to accept 10 women to become pilots or pilot trainees. And so he nominated her, and she was one of the 10 women selected to be a pilot trainee that year for the Air Force in 1978 when she graduated. So Eileen went to Vance Air Force Base in Oklahoma, Enid, Oklahoma, and she had actually, between her junior and senior years, had used money from her odd jobs to pay for some flying lessons. And she got far enough along that she was able to solo a couple of times. Didn't get her license, but the soloing helped her make her an attractive candidate for her for applying for the Air Force. So here she is with one of her training aircraft in the pre-qualification for being an Air Force pilot. When she went to Vance Air Force Base, she was one of 4 women who were sent there as pilot trainees. And she said that she had a really unusual encounter her first day there. She was in her flight suit and was in the PX and was buying something. And the cashier said to her, the women don't want you here. And Eileen was shocked, and she said, "What do you mean?" And the cashier said, "Well, they think you're going to run away with their husbands on cross-country flights, so the women really don't want you here." And so, for Eileen, this was a real shock, and it made her realize that she needed to reach out to the women, not only to be accepted by the men in her class now, but she also needed to be accepted by their wives as well. And so, when she went to one of the very first parties that her classmates were holding, she said she walked in the door and she saw that all the women were standing in the living room talking about how they're going to be decorating their houses. All the men, the pilots, were off in the kitchen talking about their instructors and the flight plans and things like that. And she wasn't sure which group she should go to and hang out with. She said naturally, as a pilot trainee, she wanted to go hang out with the pilots talking about things, but she realized she really needed to make the women feel comfortable with her first before she even thought about trying to go on with the men and talk to them. So this was the kind of thing that started happening as somebody who was going through a change that was being mandated by the system. There are still all kinds of day-to-day things that, even if the rules say you have to admit women pilots now, there's all kinds of traditions and other things like that needed to be thought about. And in a lot of cases, these weren't even considered until they became issues, or somebody brought up this was a tradition for doing things a certain way. So she had to be very careful about how she went about navigating that process. So after she graduated from flight school, she really loved the T-38 Talon. This was the same airplane that the astronauts fly. And she said she felt like flying this airplane was like strapping the plane onto her rather than strapping herself into the plane. It just felt like a natural fit to her. She really loved flying supersonic jets. And when she graduated, she was made the first female instructor pilot for the Air Force in T-38s. And so she accumulated a lot of flying time. She started realizing now that the possibility existed that she could become an astronaut. Right about this time was when NASA selected the first group of astronaut trainees for the Space Shuttle program, which included 6 women. And now there was a path forward for women to go into the space program. In the early years, in Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo, you had to be a test pilot to get into the astronaut program. And so there was no rule against women per se being an astronaut, but because women were not allowed into the services and could not fly high performance jets, women couldn't become test pilots and therefore couldn't qualify to become an astronaut. But now with the Space Shuttle program, women could fly as payload specialists or mission specialists. And so Eileen now saw there was a possibility of her being able to get into space, something she'd dreamed about ever since the Gemini program. So she worked, knowing that she needed to get into the service, the Air Force test pilot program at Edwards Air Force Base. She started trying to accumulate as many flying hours as she could. So she worked a lot of extra shifts. When her fellow instructors wanted to be at home for the weekends, she would help take over for them so that she could accumulate more flying hours, and quickly got more than 1,000 hours behind the stick of the T-38. And this is her in her graduation from flight school. The helmet she painted herself. Her initials are EMC, Eileen Marie Collins. And so she turned the EMC into E equals MC squared. It's on the other side of her helmet, unfortunately, but that she said she still has that helmet at home. Here she is as an instructor pilot with a European flight student. And she became a check pilot. These are people who flew along with you to make sure that you were going to, that you passed to be able to get to your next level of proficiency in flying. So she was one of the, I think she may have been the first Air Force female check pilot. Obviously, you can see her with a group of guys here. So when she finished as that first assignment, she wanted to move on to flying something else, and she put in on her application to fly the fastest types of jets that the airplane had, that the Air Force had. She wanted to fly F-15s, she wanted to fly F-4s or any other kind of fast airplane. But the rule at the time was that even though women could be pilots, they could not fly combat aircraft, even if they were flying them just in the U.S. It was considered to be women potentially being sent into combat. And so she was not allowed to fly high performance planes, which potentially could get in her way of getting into test pilot school. But she did get into flying the C-141 Starlifter, which was a cargo plane. And so she actually said this ended up turning out to be really good training for her for the space shuttle program later on, because she learned how to work with teams of people in the cockpit. Rather than just a pilot and a co-pilot, now she had a team of 5 people that she was working with, and it helped her to understand how to work in cockpit resource management and how to make sure you're communicating with folks in the cockpit. So she flew a lot of cargo routes, mostly across the South Pacific. She was based at Holloman Air Force Base in California, and she did a lot of flights to Guam and other places like that, out to the Indian Ocean and back again. Then in October of 1982, you'll remember that there was a suicide bombing of the U.S. Marine Corps barracks in Beirut, and a lot of several hundred Marines were killed. And so Eileen's group was called on to fly some Marines over to Beirut to replace, to fill back in the garrison there. So her flight went to Cherry Point, North Carolina, picked up the Marines, flew them to Germany, went as far as Germany. Then she had to time out on her flight. Somebody else took the plane into Beirut. Then they went back to the States, and as they were coming into Dover Air Force Base, they were told that the United States had just invaded Grenada to kick out the Cuban-led military regime there. And so Eileen's group was told, "You're taking soldiers from the 82nd Airborne to Grenada." So even though this was a combat zone and women were not allowed in combat, they were the people on the ground at the time and available. And so Eileen flew an unarmed C-141 transport plane into Grenada in the middle of combat. The Marines had just secured the airfield when she landed there. And so even though women were not allowed in combat, she got combat pay and a combat medal for the flight. So she said she learned from that the rules go out the window when your country needs you. So she finished up her time as a cargo transport pilot, and again now needed to probably work on her academics. So she worked on getting a master's, and as another way of rounding out her career, looked for a way to go to the Air Force Academy. Women were not allowed when she had started off, women were not allowed as cadets at the Air Force Academy, but they could be instructors there. So she went there as a math instructor. And actually, just before she went, she met another C-141 pilot named Pat Youngs. And he actually also got assigned to the Air Force Academy at the same time as the golf instructor there. So Eileen was teaching math and flying, and her boyfriend Pat Youngs, who became her husband that very first year at the Air Force Academy, was the golf instructor. As after they got married, here's Eileen and Pat. Pat realized, or they both realized, that when their time finished up at the Air Force Academy, it was very likely that the two of them could get deployed in different ways. The Air Force didn't really care if you were married. If there was a married couple, one could get assigned to one place and one could get assigned to another place. And Pat realized that Eileen had much more drive and much more ambition to go places in her career than he did. He was much more interested in playing golf. And so he decided to leave the Air Force and become a pilot for Delta Airlines and support Eileen in her career, which I think was just a fantastic thing back in the 1980s. Very forward thinking, and again, him realizing her potential for going forward. So Eileen got a second master's degree while she was there at the Air Force Academy, again putting herself through school. Well, now on the Air Force's dime. By the way, she also was an avid amateur amateur astronomer. She learned that, picked up that love when she was at Vance Air Force Base in Oklahoma. She said, very, very dark skies out in the middle of nowhere in Oklahoma. She bought herself several telescopes, and astronomy has been one of her loves ever since that. Anyway, so she missed out on a couple of occasions to get into the Air Force test pilot school because of some technicalities in the process. And in her last year that she would have been eligible for that, she was finally able to get in. And she became the second woman pilot at the U.S. Air Force Test Pilot School in Edwards Air Force Base in the fall of 1989. And that same year, she also heard that NASA was accepting applications for the astronaut corps. So she submitted an application, which basically none of her friends knew about, none of her family knew about. Her husband knew about it, but she submitted the application. And to her surprise, she got called in for an interview in October of 1989. When she went down there, there were a lot of people, you've probably heard the stories about how grueling the interview process and the medical checks are. She said she was just there more to have fun than anything else and just kind of relaxed and enjoyed the process. And when it came time for her interview, the board kept asking her, are you applying to be a mission specialist or are you applying to be a pilot? And she said, I'm not going to answer that question. I'll let you decide how you best need me. I'm happy to do whatever you ask me to do. And she said, they kept asking her that question, do you want to be a mission specialist or do you want to be a pilot? And she would not budge from her answer, I'll do whatever you want me to do. And in January of 1990, she had just come back from a test flight back at Edwards, and the phone call, there was a message saying, call NASA at Houston. She called them up and was put on the phone with John Young, who was the chief astronaut at the time, a moonwalker, a man who had been the head of the review board, the selection board when she was there. He said, are you still interested in being an astronaut? If so, here's what the duties look like. And he went through a long process of describing to her what the typical day of an astronaut trainee looks like, and she would have to move to Houston, et cetera, et cetera. Then after several minutes, he said, do you have any questions? And she said, well, yeah, am I going to be an astronaut? Am I going to be a pilot or am I going to be a mission specialist? And John Young told her, he said, you're going to be a pilot. You're going to be NASA's first woman pilot. So she graduated from test pilot school that year, went to NASA in the summer of 1990. It was a really tough time for NASA because they had just deployed the Hubble Space Telescope earlier that year, and of course the optics were flawed on it, and NASA was under the scrutiny of Congress very intensely, very close to being the end of NASA because of that very public failure, which eventually got corrected. But the astronauts definitely felt themselves to be in the crosshairs. Eileen was one of a class of this was class 13 of the astronaut corps. They wanted to call themselves, the Black Cats or something like that, but NASA headquarters didn't like the idea of the unlucky 13 thing. So they called themselves, instead of the Black Cats, they called themselves the Hairballs. But so that's the name of NASA class 13. In this group of astronauts here, there are a number of people who went on to become very famous. Eileen is down at the next to bottom row on the left-hand side. You'll see in this group here, Bernard Harris, who became the first African-American to walk in space. Immediately in front of him is the first woman, the first military woman to fly in space. We have the first Hispanic woman to fly astronaut here. a number of people who became very famous later on in NASA. Tom Jones is also in this picture in her class there. Tom went on to become a multiple spacewalker and have a very distinguished career at NASA. So when you start off as an astronaut, you're what they call an ASCAN, an astronaut candidate. And so you haven't been picked for a mission yet. There's nothing for you to train for. And so you're given various types of jobs at NASA to teach you the system. Eileen was working on some space shuttle systems, but her favorite assignment was being sent to Kennedy Space Center as what they call a Cape Crusader. And this is an astronaut who helps check out the hardware at Kennedy Space Center before a mission. For example, if they're getting the space shuttle ready in the processing hangar, the ASCAN maybe would sit in there and throw switches during tests of some of the orbiter systems and things like that. And when the space shuttle is stacked and getting ready for launch, they'll go in and make sure that all the switches are properly configured before the crew gets in for their flight. So Eileen really enjoyed doing that. Here she is with the closeout crew before one of the missions. And she said this was one of her favorite things because she really got a chance to know the hardware very, very well, the actual flight hardware. And it wasn't too long before she would be one of the people that the closeout crew would be strapping in themselves. So she kept wondering when her first mission was going to be. And there was rumors that she was going to be on one of the Hubble repair missions. And she got very excited about that. And then when the crew was announced, she wasn't announced as one of those members of the crew, which made her very upset. As you can imagine, you've been waiting a long time to find out if you're going to fly. And apparently it was determined that because it was such a high profile mission, they wanted to make sure that they didn't have any rookies on the crew. And so she was not put on the crew, but she had to deal with the disappointment of being told she was going to fly and then not actually going to be able to fly. And one of the lessons we talk about in the book is how you deal with failure or disappointment, and how people are watching you to see how you react when things don't go your way. This is something that's true in every walk of life. People are watching you. If you don't get what you want, they want to see what kind of person you are and how you push through that kind of disappointment. So eventually the time did come when she got named to a mission, STS-63, which was to be the first time that an American space shuttle got close to the Mir space station, the Russian Mir space station. And this was going to be the first time that a woman sat in the pilot seat of the space shuttle. The commander of the space shuttle sits in the left seat, and he or she is the one that actually takes the controls and does most of the flying. The pilot has a very active role in the flight. The pilot has to do things, for example, like deploy the nose landing gear and other things like that. So a very necessary role, but the commander is the one who's doing the actual flying, but the pilot is there to help with that. So this was a momentous occasion for NASA to have now a woman flying as pilot rather than just as a mission specialist. Eileen, recognizing her place in history here and also dealing with some of the pressure that was on her, wanted to make sure she shared this with this occasion and celebrated this occasion with a lot of people who had come before her. This is a group that was called the Mercury 13, where these are the surviving members of the Mercury 13. These were 13 women who were picked by a private organization at the same time that the Mercury astronauts were picked, to see if women could pass the same physical requirements that men could for the Mercury program. And these 13 women all actually met or exceeded NASA's requirements for becoming astronauts. But because, again, of the not being able to be test pilots, they were not able to be selected to be astronauts. These women all were pilots in their own right and were very good pilots as well. Eileen made sure to invite the surviving members of the Mercury 13 to come to her launch. One of them actually did go into space. Wally Funk is the second woman from the left in this picture here. She eventually flew with Blue Origin a couple of years ago. Eileen also invited Valentina Tereshkova, who was the first woman to fly in space, the Russian cosmonaut. Very interesting. It was kept very private, and we have not been able to find any photographs of Eileen and Valentina Tereshkova together, although I've talked to many people who said they were there at the astronaut beach house before the mission when Valentina was there. So anyway, the time came for the launch. Things went very well on that. There's a great first chapter of the book is Eileen's blow by blow description of what it's like to launch into space and suddenly see her first sunrise from outer space. Her first realization was also that she was getting space adaptation syndrome or space sickness. This is something that happens to about half of the astronauts, and you can't really predict who it's going to happen to. Eileen said she'd never been sick in an airplane before, but she was really not feeling very good at all for her first couple of days. The disorientation of trying to do some sort of work. She said, for example, she was putting together the treadmill in the cargo, in the lower deck of the space shuttle, putting together the treadmill, and she'd look up and her body had rotated at 90 or 180 degrees from where she'd been before, and that disorientation was enough to make her not feel very well. It eventually passed after a couple of days, but it's something that still bothers astronauts to this day. Here's Eileen with her crew. Bernard Harris is at the lower right. He was one of her classmates, as is Janice Voss, who is above Bernard Harris here. Bernard and became the first African-American to walk in space on this mission. Also, you have here Mr. Titov in the upper left. He was the second Russian to fly aboard the space shuttle. And they approached the space station Mir. The first time that an American spacecraft had approached a Russian space station, this is what Mir looked like in that mission. And there in the window is Valery Polyakov, who went on to become to hold the record for the longest amount of time in space. I think it was something like 430 days in space continuously aboard Mir, a record that's still never been broken. Here's Eileen in the pilot's seat. You'll see strapped to the chair there at the bottom of the middle there is a package of wheat checks, and that's pretty much, she said, all she could keep down for the first couple of days. After they left Mir, they got within 33 feet of Mir. That was all they were supposed to do, was just to see if they could rendezvous with Mir and then move away from it. It was left to the next mission to do the actual docking. There was a space hab module in the cargo bay of the space shuttle, and Eileen had a few experiments to run in addition to being the pilot. One of them was this Coca-Cola experiment. Coke had paid for this cargo, this experiment to fly. The idea was to find out if Coke and Diet Coke tasted the same in outer space that they taste on Earth. Eileen thought it was an interesting experiment. It was one of those things that even though Coke had completely paid for this and paid for the time needed to do this, it was considered to be, I think it had kind of a giggle factor that people didn't appreciate, and they didn't show live footage of her actually testing out the experiment. And she said, Coke tastes the same in space that it tastes here on the ground. The difference is that you really, you don't crave sweets up there as much as you would crave salty things, because your fluid imbalance, or your body is trying to get rid of fluids all the time. So you're always craving salts. So anyway, her mission finished successfully. She became pregnant almost immediately after coming back to the States, coming back to Earth. And she had her daughter Bridget about 9 months after the end of her mission. And it was several years later she was selected for the next mission, STS-84, where she was also again pilot, this time going back to the Mir space station and docking with Mir. This was the only mission she flew. Of the 4 that she flew, she said this was the only one that launched at the exact time and date that was announced ahead of time. All the other ones had some sort of flight delays, which was pretty common with the space shuttle. This time again, they docked with Mir, and here's the way the Mir space station looked when they docked. A couple months before this mission, there had been a fire aboard Mir. One of the oxygen canisters had caught fire and caused quite a serious problem. There were open flames and smoke inside Mir, and so the space shuttle crew was very careful when they came in there. The commander of Mir had put, when you see the red fabric over there near the porthole on the right, that was to indicate the direction they would go to get back to the space shuttle if they needed to. You can see it's a pretty confusing looking place with all of these various passageways leading out of the node of Mir. But here's the crew of Mir, and Eileen and her space shuttle crew. And again, they ran space hab experiments after the docking with Mir. This was a picture of Greece. Eileen has a really nice long passage about what it was like for her to fly over the Mediterranean on a rare bit of downtime and kind of look down there and think about the vast amount of history that she was flying over in just a few minutes here, how people had fought and traded over these seas here for thousands and thousands of years. So the time came for her next mission, and again, being an avid astronomer, she heard about the Chandra X-ray Observatory as an upcoming mission, and she volunteered, where she said, if there's ever an opportunity for me to fly another mission, I would love to fly a space telescope into outer space. And so she got the news one afternoon in March that she was going to be the commander of STS-93 to deploy the Chandra X-ray Observatory. And they said, and by the way, you're meeting with the Clintons at the White House next week. And so she went there for the announcement and had a nice conversation with the Clintons before the meeting happened. She said one of the few times she ever felt scared in her life was when she looked into the Roosevelt room across from the Oval Office and saw that it was full of reporters and bright lights and cameras. She said she kind of was frozen with fear for a few seconds before she realized. She said, Eileen can't go in here, but the commander can go in there. And so she kind of put her commander visage on and walked in there and did the press conference. And I think when you hear astronauts talking about, when people ask them, what emotions did you feel on the moon, or did you feel scared during launch or whatever, they'll tell you that they compartmentalize their feelings between that if you allow fear or emotions to take over in a very intense moment, it can be very detrimental for you. And so this was an opportunity for her to kind of compartmentalize her emotions off to one side and just act as the commander. So she started, she had been flying training missions. This is the training aircraft for the shuttle, specially modified Gulfstream aircraft that comes down at a very steep angle like the space shuttle does. The commander of the space shuttle has to fly 1,000 approaches in this aircraft to simulate landings and to get really good at the way the space shuttle handles. So the pilot has to fly 500 approaches. The commander has to fly 1,000 of them. Here she is at the controls of that aircraft. This is the Chandra X-ray Observatory at the upper left. The white and gold part below it is the booster that takes it from the space shuttle out into orbit. And so the goal was to fly this. This was the heaviest payload the space shuttle ever flew, to take this up into orbit, deploy Chandra on the first orbit, and then have a few days to do some other science while up there. Here's Eileen in the commander's seat, getting ready for launch, a simulated launch on the test, the countdown test day. The first day that they were supposed to launch, there was the countdown clock got down to just a fraction of a second before the main engines were supposed to start, and then somebody detected a hydrogen leak in the aft compartment of the space shuttle and stopped the countdown just before the engines ignited. So that launch was scrubbed for a couple of days. The next day, next launch opportunity was rained out, and then finally on the third attempt they launched. And I'm gonna show you the launch here. You'll hear a little bit of unusual talking that's going on right as the space shuttle took off. You'll hear a talk about a main bus B. There was a short circuit that took the fuel cells offline and took the one of the two AC power buses offline as the space shuttle was taking off. It also knocked out two of the engine controllers, one on the center engine and one on the right-hand engine, so that the space shuttle was now flying without backups on those two engines. In addition to that,
10,
let's do this
9,
first.
8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3. We have a go for engine start, 0. We have booster ignition and liftoff of Columbia, reaching new heights for women in X-ray astronomy.
Houston now control.
Houston, Columbia is in the roll. We've got a fuel cell PH number 1.
Roger roll, Columbia, we're looking at. Columbia, Houston, we'd like AC bus sensors off. We're evaluating the fuel cell.
And
Columbia,
that's complete, Scooter.
roger that, Columbia. Looks like we had a transient on AC1.
Columbia is now headed downrange, altitude 3.8 miles. And as we hear, all systems okay. It looks like a sensor on board. 3 engines throttling down, all at 67%.
Columbia, Houston, we are critical to AC2 on the center engine, AC3 on the right. We've lost DCU-A on the center and DCU-B on the right.
Copy that.
Anyway, so they continued to fly. If another computer had gone down, they would have had to abort the mission immediately. And they were detecting that there was a hydrogen leak going on as well as they were ascending into orbit. The space shuttle burns liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen. After the flight, they came. The space shuttle came back. They looked at the right engine, and you'll see this. There's a discolored area in that right engine, and there were 3 cooling tubes that carried liquid hydrogen to cool down the engine bell. Those were punctured by a pin that got shot out of the injector plate in the engine. It punctured these 3 cooling tubes, and so the space shuttle was leaking liquid hydrogen through its engine there. If that pin had punctured 2 more of those tubes next to it, it would have caused a catastrophic failure of that engine nozzle, and the space shuttle would have exploded on the way into orbit. So this was probably the closest that NASA came to losing another space shuttle on launch, like Space Shuttle Challenger. Just amazing that she was able to make it. This is a picture of a bird screw. There's a screw with you can see a little bit of metal sticking out there. That was rubbing against a wire in the cargo bay, which caused the short circuit, which brought down those engine sensors. But they got into orbit safely, and they were able to deploy the Chandra X-ray Observatory, which was designed to last for 5 years, but it's still returning great science. There's a picture on the left here of the black hole at the center of the Crab Nebula and Cassiopeia A on the right-hand side. We're still getting great results back from China, and Eileen is extremely proud of that. This is her with her daughter after coming back from that flight. This was a NASA safety poster. Eileen was going to fly one final mission in March of 2003, STS-114, which was going to be a resupply mission to the space station. It was going to be a routine flight. When that flight was over, she was going to retire from NASA and their family would move to Florida. Of course, we had the Space Shuttle Columbia accident in February of 2003, which caused the stand down of the space shuttle. Eileen said she was not about to quit NASA at that point. She thought it would look really bad for NASA if she went ahead and retired anyway. And so she vowed to stay on, and NASA was very happy to have her stay on and lead the preparations for the next mission, STS-114. This was an opportunity to correct a lot of the things that had gone wrong with the space shuttle. It was not just the foam coming off the external fuel tank. There were problems with the engines, that the motors that separated the solid rocket boosters. There were problems with the steering actuators and the rudder and things like that. A lot of these got corrected, which NASA probably was going to get around to one of these days, but they just didn't have the time to do it under the press to try to get the International Space Station complete. So finally, July of 2005 came, a little more than 2 years after the Space Shuttle Columbia accident, and Eileen was behind the controls of Discovery for her final mission.
25.
Firing chain is armed.
20.
Sound pressure water system is activated. T-minus 10 seconds. Go for main engine start. 7, 6, 5. 3 engines up and burning. 3, 2, 1. And liftoff of Space Shuttle Discovery, beginning America's new journey to the moon, Mars, and beyond.
as much as I'd like to show more of that launch, I didn't realize we're running out of time here. There was we thought they had solved the problem of the foam coming off the external fuel tank, but during launch, there was another piece of foam that came off of Discovery's fuel tank and just barely missed hitting Discovery's wing. And so NASA realized that the foam shedding problem had not been solved. And so after this mission, the space shuttle was stood down for again another year until they fixed the foam issue. But it was a real serious concern. Had this hit the wing of Discovery, the astronauts would have stayed at the International Space Station until a rescue mission could come up and get them 6 months later. Eileen got the opportunity to fly the very first rendezvous pitch around maneuver. This was a maneuver that was designed to allow the astronauts on the space station to photograph the underside of the space shuttle with long lenses to look for any damage that might have occurred during launch. And this was it became a standard maneuver for the rest of the space shuttle program after the Columbia accident. Here they are approaching the International Space Station, and Eileen in the airlock area. So mission accomplished August 9th, 2005. Eileen finished her last mission. She said it was a lot harder coming back to Earth now, 10 years, her being 10 years older than she was on her first mission. She was about 35 years old on her first mission. Now she was 45, actually closer to 49 at this point now. And so she, as promised, retired from NASA and went into private life. She spent a lot of time working on corporate boards. She was on the board at USAA for 15 years and has been very active as a public speaker. And it was, when I got to know her when I was writing my book about Columbia, and it really surprised me that she had never written her memoirs. Somebody as famous as her and with such an inspiring story, I thought people needed to hear that. And she said, well, she was always too busy with things. And then when COVID hit in 2020, she called me up in April, in May of 2020, and she said, are you still interested in working on the book together? And so we ended up writing the book entirely virtually. We did it all by phone and Zoom and FaceTime and things like that. So this is Eileen and me working together over the course of several months. We spent about a year writing her memoirs down, trading material back and forth, and she had me do the research on the space shuttle missions, but she obviously supplied a lot of the material about her personal life that it was not available to public records. And so finally, the book came out a year and a half ago. This was us, the first time we got together in face to face. The book had already been turned into the publisher at this point. She's been a great friend since that. This is a great badge to have in my collection. She invited me to be her +1 for the Astronaut Hall of Fame induction ceremony last year, which was a great honor. She and I did a talk at the Smithsonian in Washington, and where my family lives. And so I asked her if she wouldn't mind having dinner with my kids and my grandkids. And so here she is, nicely putting up with my family, which was a real thrill. She's just the warmest human being you could possibly imagine, the nicest person you ever met. And everybody who's ever worked with her will tell you that as well. And then here we were the next day at Discovery at the Air and Space Museum. But what she does best is inspire young people. And here she is at the in Oshkosh at the EAA annual thing here. This is inspiring about 5,000 young women who had come to hear her talk. She is just an amazing speaker. And I hope you get a chance to meet her someday, because she is just one of the best people there is out there. And so a real thrilled that the book is doing well. And we just announced last week, where the announcement just came out last week, that there's a documentary being made based on the book called Space Woman. And this will be in theaters and streaming probably early next year. So with that, I am going to finish up and open the floor up for questions for people. Thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you, Jonathan. That was wonderful. Let me ask first for members of our live audience if they have questions to raise their hand, and I'll bring the mic around. Yeah, the lights are up. Anybody? Questions?
I have one.
Yes.
I'm currently Thank you so much. It was a wonderful presentation. I'm currently reading your book. I actually got it before I knew you were speaking. And it's all written in first person. Is that something she wanted? She wanted it to sound like an autobiography, personal?
It is her memoirs. It's her autobiography. Yeah. So she was very generous to let me put my name on the cover of the book, but it's definitely her story. I helped her tell it. Right. But I helped her organize it. She did most of the writing herself, or I should say all of those words in there are hers.
Hi. Thanks for this talk. It's very inspiring, and I'm glad my granddaughters were here to hear it. I wanted to ask you about her left eye. Apparently, she had, throughout her career of applying for different positions, trouble with her left eye, like depth perception, acuity of vision, and so on. And yet, people found a way to allay their own concerns about it through retesting or using a different kind of test. That seems, if that hadn't been done, she wouldn't have gotten where she was. How important was the medical part for her?
That's that's a great point. Yeah, there were a couple of occasions where where she failed a vision test the first time, and then was able to go back and retake it. The first time, even to be able to qualify to go into flight school, she failed it the first time, and then went back and retook the test and was able to pass it. So it was just kind of marginal. Again, I mean, we're talking 20/20 vision, but the super acuity. The second time she failed an exam was a depth perception exam as part of the astronaut interview process, and they said that the exam was very finicky, and they recommended that she take an alternate exam, which was had shown to be just as effective, and so she passed the alternate exam. It turned out the next year, or the next class of astronauts, they stopped using that alternate exam. So had she not applied when she did, had she waited one more time, that she would not have been qualified to become a pilot, because she wouldn't have passed the depth perception exam. So one of the things we talk about, and she recognizes the fact that she got to do what she did. A lot of it is luck. It's the luck of timing. The reason she got to be first was because she just happened to be the right age at the right time when the service academy or when the services started admitting people. The Apollo astronauts will tell you the same thing. The ones who went to the moon were all born in 1930, or right around that same time frame. They were at the right age when it came time to get things done. So there is that element of luck, and I think all of us have that element of luck, that we happen to be in the right place at the right time. But you have to have the right kind of training and skills that will take advantage of that opportunity when it presents itself to you, and you have to be willing to say yes and to step out of your comfort zone.
Any other questions? Anybody? So any members of our online audience, you can unmute yourselves and ask.
Jonathan, I just want to say it was an excellent presentation. I enjoyed it very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlie.
Yeah, Jonathan, I read the book. It was very good. Excellent. I was surprised how candid she was about her life and her struggles. And I think there's one thing that I got with it. She worked extremely hard to get where she was.
That's a great point. Yeah, she will. That first chapter about her early life, that took us longer to write than pretty much the rest of the book put together. I think we probably spent 3 months writing that first chapter, because she really wanted to make it. She wanted to let people know that she had to struggle and she had to work hard, but she went out of her way to say, I don't want to blame my parents for who they were. And she dedicated the book to her parents, even though they both had their own sets of failings. But she will tell you, and I don't know if you've ever met any other astronauts, but I have never met anybody in the world that has the capacity for work that astronauts do. They are always on the go. They are the hardest workers you will ever meet. And she is certainly one of them. She is just a complete dynamo. And I think they're the proof that that hard work will outdo smarts anytime.
Excellent book.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Well, okay. Jonathan, thank you so much. It was inspiring. And
thank you, everybody.
Okay. All right, I guess we're gonna go back to Sperry for some refreshments. And now, motion. Thank you very much.